Well, good evening. How are we tonight? Yeah? Excellent. My name is Chris. If you don't know who I am or why I'm here, I'm part of the preaching team here at Revolution, and I'm always excited to come and be with you guys, particularly up here in Jasper. And tonight, if tonight's your first night, we want to say welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for hanging out. We are in week 2 of our series that we've called Naming God, right? And what we've been talking about, or what we talked about last week, what we'll continue talking about over the next few weeks, is these names of God, right? Like, it's exactly what it sounds like. That we are taking some specific names that we call God and talking about what they mean, because when we talk about what they mean, maybe we understand and know God a little bit better. And if we know God a little bit better, maybe we know who we are a little bit better and how we fit into God's story. And so that's what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. And if you were here last week, what Jeremy did for us last week is help us understand and know and discover, maybe you didn't know this name of God before, but this very distinct, very unique and specific name of God to the Bible, which is Yahweh, right? That he is the God that's revealed to Moses at the burning bush. I am who I am, Yahweh. It's a very distinct, very unique, very specific name given only to the God in the Bible. Okay, so there are no other Yahwehs. There are no other like a kind of, Yahweh part 2s. Like, it's just Yahweh and nobody else. It's this very unique, distinct name. But what I'm going to be doing tonight is I'm going to be going the opposite direction, right? If last week we talked about a very distinct, unique name, tonight what I'm going to be talking about is a very generic name. And that name that we call God is Elohim. Elohim. It's a Hebrew word, Elohim, and it's used all throughout the Bible, well, all throughout the Old Testament, because the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Now, this word Elohim, this name Elohim, again, is distinct from what we talked about last week because it's very generic. And we'll talk about how generic here in the next few minutes. But if you're in our culture, if you're in Western civilization, and you want to have a spiritual conversation with someone, maybe the first spiritual conversation that you have, or maybe it's someone that you don't really know all that well, and you want to have this spiritual kind of conversation, what you might start out that conversation is something like, do you believe in what? God, right? It's a very generic word, very generic name for God. Do you believe in God, or what do you believe about God? And that's a very good place to start. It's a very natural place to start. If we want to talk about spiritual things, maybe we should start with, what do you believe, or who do you think God is? It's a very natural, very, very appropriate way to start. And it's very important because what we think about God matters. In fact, A.W. Tozer, in his book, The Knowledge of the Holy, says this. He says, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. When we think about God, the picture that we have in our mind is the most important thing about us, says A.W. Tozer. Now, one of the issues with God, that word God, that name God, is that when we're having these kinds of conversations, one of the good things about it is, hey, it kind of gives us this blanket kind of meaning that we all kind of share, right? We can build some common ground here. Hey, do you believe in God? Sure, I believe in God. Or maybe I don't believe in God, but at least we know what we're talking about. When we think God, we think, okay, maybe he created everything. Maybe he's some kind of spiritual force that kind of put the world in motion. Maybe he's, this being or this person or this force that kind of controls everything and runs everything. And so we kind of have this common ground that we can all kind of come to the middle on when we talk about God, G-O-D. But if you start to press down on that a little bit, if you start to filter down and say, okay, well, let's get into some specifics about what we believe about God, you find very quickly that a lot of us have very different understandings of what God is or who God is. We might think that God is loving, that he loves everybody, and that we're his children. Or maybe we think that God is really concerned about right and wrong, and that's his highest value. Maybe we think that he's not even a he. Maybe he's a she, or an it, or a force, or something impersonal. Maybe we think he just kind of spun the universe like a dreidel and just kind of watches it spin and is disengaged. We can have different ideas or different thoughts when it comes to this idea of God. We can have different definitions. It's a very generic term. In the same way that Elohim is a generic term in the original Hebrew. In fact, when you look at the word, Elohim has a wide range of meanings just like the word God, because Elohim means God. Elohim comes from the root word El, okay, E-L. And El means, it can mean God, like the creator, capital G, God, or it can mean lowercase g, God, like maybe there's a bunch of them, maybe there's some smaller ones, and, not only that, it translates God or God, big G or little g, but it can also translate mighty one. And what's very interesting about this word is if you look at it, El means God or God and mighty one. But Elohim is actually the masculine plural of that word. I know we're not in school, and I know this is probably make your eyes gloss over, but it's like putting an S on the end of the word. It can be a group of them, okay? So Elohim is the plural form of El, but you use Elohim to describe multiple, or you use Elohim, the plural verb, or the plural conjugation, I guess, to describe one. Isn't that interesting that it's one and more than one at the same time? And so we can be talking about God as Elohim, or we can be talking about a group of gods as Elohim, or what you find in the Bible is that you can actually be talking about any spiritual being as Elohim. Now, before you try and get Jeremy to rush me off the stage because I'm a heretic, let's take a step back and let me try and help us understand this concept, right? Because the question that might pop into our mind is, how can Elohim, God, be talking about the creator, the God of the Bible, and yet also be talking about not the God of the Bible? If this is his name, how are we talking about the God of the Bible and yet a bunch of other different lesser beings? Well, the reason why is because Elohim is not a name. We call God Elohim, but it's not a name, it's a category title. And here, let me try and help you understand how this works. Now, my name is Chris, right? It's actually Christopher. What's on my birth certificate is Christopher. But I don't exist in a vacuum, right? I don't exist all by myself. I exist in relation to other people. I exist in relation to you guys. I exist in relation to Jeremy. I exist in relation to my wife. My wife's name is Erica, but she's also my wife, right? And I'm her husband. Now, we have a family, and in that family, we have a husband, me, a wife, Erica, and then I have 4 children. Now, I don't know, I would try to do a picture of my kids, but it's okay because they're ugly, so I'm glad we don't have the picture. So I have 4 children, right? And they each have names of their own. I have my oldest daughter, her name is Eden, and then I have 3 sons, Slade, Jet, and Justice. They're each distinct. They're distinct persons, but they're my children, right? But they don't call me by my name, do they? They don't say, hey, Chris, can you come pick me up? No, they don't, because I would bury them in the backyard if they called me Chris, right? No, what do they call me? They say, hey, Dad, right? It's a category title, just like Elohim. But what's interesting about this is if they go and talk to their mother, my wife, they'll say things like, hey, is Dad coming to my football practice tonight? Or is Dad coming to my gymnastics meet this weekend? Or why is Dad so angry all the time? Or why does Dad cry himself to sleep? Okay, the reason they ask that, they use this category title, Dad. I'm not the only dad. I'm not even the only dad in this room, right? I'm a part of a bunch of dads. My dad was a dad. Jeremy is a dad. Your dad is a dad. All the dads are dads, right? Are you with me? It's a category title. But they use that category title in relation to me specifically. They call me Dad like it's my name. In fact, that's the appropriate thing for them to call me. And even more so, if you push it a little bit further, if Jeremy and I are standing together, right? Now, I'm a dad. I have children. Jeremy's a dad. He has a son named Whitaker, and both of our children call us Dad. It calls us Dad like it's our name. But if one of my kids comes up and says, hey, Dad, can I go play outside? We immediately and intuitively know they're talking to me. They're not talking to Jeremy, even though Jeremy is a dad. That is part of his title, and that's what his child calls him. That is his name to his child, right? But if my kid comes up to the 2 of us and says, hey, Dad, we know they're talking to me because I'm his dad or her dad. So it's a category title that's sometimes used as a name, and even more than that, it's sometimes used as a personal name. That's the exact same way that the biblical writers use the word Elohim. It's a category title. It can incorporate a lot of dads, right? A lot of Elohim. But it's also used as a name for one specific person. And it's even used as a personal name, just like dad, right? Okay, so it's a category title that's sometimes used as a name. But let's take a look at some of the ways that Elohim is used in the Bible. Now, I'm gonna start with probably the least, the least used, the least common, but probably the most surprising, okay? So in 1 Samuel, let me give you some context around what we're about to read. In 1 Samuel, it's named after the prophet Samuel, okay? And the prophet Samuel is the prophet to King Saul. He was Israel's first king. But at this point in the book, in the Bible, Samuel the prophet has died. So Saul has no more Samuel. And so Saul is about to enter into a battle with the Philistines. And he sees the army and he gets a little bit nervous. And so it's common practice when you're about to go into a battle as a king to go and consult God. And so he prays to God. He goes to consult God. Hey, can I win this? What should I do? How do I approach this? But God's not answering his prayers. So he doesn't hear anything from God. He's consulting God, hears nothing. And the way that God would speak, he'd speak to him through dreams. He'd speak to him through the prophet. He would speak to him through something called the Urim and the Urim and Thummim, which is just kind of like rolling the dice to kind of get an answer from God. And so God's not speaking to him at any of these things. So he's getting desperate. And so he tells his staff, he's like, hey, like, is there anybody, like, do we have any witches available, right? Which is horrible because the law of God forbade consulting people who practice witchcraft or sorcery or anything like that. In fact, the law commanded the Israelites to put those people to death. That's how seriously they took witchcraft. And King Saul himself actually practiced that. He had gotten rid of all the witches and the mediums and stuff like that. And so now he's getting desperate, and so he's like, hey, are there any of those witches left? And they're like, yeah, we know this one witch. This is the witch of Endor. That's what we call her. And so he's like, okay, take me to her. So that's where we pick up our story. So King Saul is just looking for some word from God. He wants to hear from God about this battle that he's about to engage in. And we pick up in 1 Samuel 28, verse 9. Remember, this is all in the context of Elohim. In verse 9, he meets this witch. This is the woman. He says, the woman says to him, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Now, Saul comes to her in disguise. That's why she's talking to him as if she doesn't know him. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? She's like, if Saul finds out, he's going to kill me. But Saul swore to her by, if you remember last week, Yahweh, okay, the distinct name for the God of Israel, as Yahweh lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, who shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, ah! And the woman said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. Okay, so she figures it out somehow. And the king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see an Elohim coming up out of the earth. Your translation probably says a God coming out of the earth. Okay, so she sees God. He says to her, what is his appearance? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. Oh man, now our category is blown wide open, right? If God's name is Elohim, now we're looking at a human being who's died, whose spirit's being conjured up by some witch. And the Bible and the woman calls him an Elohim. So now we know not only is it just spiritual beings, but it's in even a disembodied human spirit can be called an Elohim. Very fascinating, right? So weird. How can this be? How can we call God Elohim, but even human spirits are Elohim? Because they are part of the spiritual world. It can be used to talk about anybody in the spiritual realm. All right, so let's move on. So you have a disembodied human spirit called Elohim in the Bible. This is not my translation. This is the original language. So then you have this group of divine beings called the divine council. Now, in the Bible, the divine council has a number of different kinds of beings that take part in the divine council. And the divine council, I don't know what their actual job description is, but what you find them doing is debating God's policy on things. Like you find them in the book of Job, talking about, hey, the whole point of the book of Job starts with them talking about, hey, does Job really love you because he loves you, or does he love you because you keep giving him stuff? Like they're debating policy almost. Okay, so they have this group of spiritual beings called the divine council, and there's a bunch of different kinds of beings. So sometimes you have angels, which are, we kind of know what angels are, or we think we know what angels are. And then we have the cherubim, which we kind of think about as like little baby angels, like Cupid, but that is not what they look like. That is not how they're described in the Bible. And then we have the seraphim, which kind of sounds like cherubim, but they're completely different. They're like flying snakes with wings, or sometimes they're described as like this mashup of different, like it's like the head of an eagle and the feet of a bear. Like they're just kind of these weird mashup of creatures with wings. So you have all these different kinds of creatures. The Satan, if you remember last time when we talked about the devil, he shows up in the book of Job as part of this divine council. So it's not just good, the good guys. It's kind of a lot of different spiritual beings, okay? So that's the divine council. Now let's look at Psalm 82, starting in verse 1, and let's see what the Bible says about the divine council. Psalm 82, verse 1 starts out, Elohim, okay? Talking about big G God. Elohim has taken his place in the divine council. Now the divine council, the original Hebrew is El Ba'adat, okay? So that means this council of divine beings, this council of spiritual beings. Still has that word El, right? That word that can mean mighty one, or big G God, or little g God. Okay, well, that's kind of weird. Let's keep reading. And so Elohim has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the Elohim, he holds judgment. Well, hold on. Which one is it? Big G God, or is it kind of little g, divine council God? The answer, if Pastor Jason was here, he'd tell us, yes, it's both. In the midst of the gods, of the Elohim, he holds judgment, meaning God, the big G God. And then he says in verse 6, I said, and now it's getting confusing. I don't even know what I'm doing up here. You are Elohim. You are little g, God's son of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, the psalmist says, O Elohim, big G, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. So now we have this divine council made up of these different spiritual beings, angels and cherubim, seraphim, the Satan, like all of them kind of in this divine council. And God, Elohim, calls them Elohim. All right, well, is that it? Let's look at Exodus 20, verse 1. You might know this from the 10 Commandments. Verse 1, and Elohim, spoke all of these words saying, I am Yahweh. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Parentheses, remember when I delivered you from all of those gods of Egypt. You shall, verse 3, you shall have no other Elohim before you. So now we have angels, part of this category type. We have the Satan, we have cherubim, seraphim. We now have these little g gods, like are in Egypt, and God, big G God, is saying, hey, I'm Elohim. Not only am I Elohim, I am Yahweh, and I'm telling you, you should have no other Elohim before me. And he's not saying, hey, put me first, and then you can have other Elohim behind me. He's saying you should have no other beside me. Meaning, this isn't just like, hey, I know this stuff is all in your head, don't do that. He's saying, no, there are legitimate, real, little g, spiritual gods that you have the option to go and worship instead of me, but I am Yahweh. You shall not worship any of those other Elohim. I am Elohim. So we've got this vast array of definitions of people that can fit into this category title, Elohim, right? We have the divine council. We have big G God. We have little g gods. Now they're coming to get me. I knew it was. Now, before you think, let me just make sure that I'm clear here. When I say, hey, listen, we got a bunch of Elohim, and Elohim is a part of it, what I'm not saying is, because it can kind of freak you out, isn't Christianity a monotheistic faith? Doesn't that mean we have one God? Then how am I talking all of a sudden about many gods? Here's what biblical monotheism is. It means there is a group of spiritual beings, but there is only one top guy. There's only one that's in a league of his own. It's not like, hey, there's like big G God, but then like some that are almost there, and if they just work a little bit harder, lift a little bit more, they can get to be Elohim part 2. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what the Bible says. In fact, when the Bible describes God, a lot of times it'll say, oh, he's the Elohim of Elohim. He's the God of gods. Or it'll say things like, there is no Elohim but Yahweh. Not that there's no Elohim at all, it's that there's no Elohim like him. He is in a category all his own. And so to call him Elohim is right and good, and you can address him as Elohim because that's his name, but it's a name that's a category title that is used as a name. There is no other Elohim like Yahweh. You get what I'm saying? Now, what does that mean for us? Because this is from the very beginning of the Bible, okay? This isn't just like halfway through, all of a sudden we're calling God something different. Look at Genesis 1:1. This is the way we started out the service. We read this at the beginning, right before I got up here. Genesis 1:1, which the word means beginning. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God, Ruach Elohim, was hovering over the face of the waters. Okay, so now we have the creator God, but it uses the word Elohim. What's it talking about? Because then it goes, if you read chapter 1, it says, then God said, then Elohim said, let there be light. And it was. He spoke with the word of his mouth, and because everything that God wants, he gets. Elohim said, let there be light, and there was light. And then he says, I think I'd like some sky. Let's create some sky. And then there it was. And he's like, I kind of want the land to come up out of the water. And there it was. He's bringing order to the chaotic creation. He creates everything, and it's chaos, is how Genesis 1 describes it. And he brings order to the chaos. And then in verse 14, if you read down a little bit, it says he put the sun and the moon. It says the bigger light and the smaller light. And the bigger light, it says, he put in the sky to rule over the day. That's the words it uses, to have dominion over the day. Okay, that's kind of weird. But then he put the smaller light to rule over the night. That's the word it uses, to rule or have dominion over the night. Okay, so now he's got these celestial beings, the sun and the moon and the stars, telling the story, and they are representative rulers for him. They rule over the day and they rule over the night. They're God's representatives, but they're God's representative rulers, right? Skip down to verse 26. Then Elohim said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion, there's that word again, over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Then verse 27, there's this little poem that says, so Elohim created man in his own image. In the image of Elohim, he created him, male and female, he created them. Verse 28, and Elohim blessed them, and Elohim said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, rule over it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So Elohim decrees all this. He creates all of these beings and animals and places for them to be, and he fills the whole earth, and he fills the heavens, and he fills the skies, and he fills the water, and he's like, sun, I want you to rule over the day. Moon, I want you to rule over the night. But man and woman, I want you to rule over everything else. You are like the sun and the moon, my representative rulers. You are my images. Not only are you my images, but you are my imagers. Not only do you look like me, but you are to project my image to everything else, meaning you are supposed to rule like I rule. Well, up at this point, how does God rule? He brings order to the chaos, and he brings light to the darkness. That's your role. That's what you were created to do, to help God, to be a real partner. This is something that I've been learning over the past 6 months, and it sounds so simple, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that this is what I'm learning right now, but that I am a partner with God. I am a legitimate, real partner with real decisions, and my actions have real consequences out in the world. It's not like God just said, okay, I'm gonna pat you on the head, and then I'm just gonna go and do it, but I'm gonna give you all the credit. No, he says, you are a real partner with me. You have real agency. What you do really matters. I'm in control and holding it all together, but you are a representative ruler on me. I'm partnering with you. And the whole point, if you're wondering hey, okay, well, it says Elohim, what is that, like the divine council? Is that whose image we're created in? Is it one of these little gods or the Satan? Like, whose image am I actually created in? Chapter 2, Genesis 2, is written in such a way in the original language to tie into chapter 1 so that you know that they go together. And here's what chapter 2 says in verse 4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Oh, that sounds familiar, like what we read in chapter 1. In the day that the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, made the earth and the heavens. You are the images and the imagers of God. You are to rule as a representative of Yahweh Elohim. A few weeks ago, I went to a concert, a Need to Breathe concert. I love that band, but I love the opening band even more, Judah and the Lion. I don't know if anybody knows that band, but they're like where I'm at right now, okay? And they have this song, it's not a new song, it's an old song, but they have this song called Beautiful Anyway that they played at the concert. And it's just a song about, hey, I know life's tough, but I want you to know that you're beautiful anyway. Even though life's going tough, I want you to know that you're still a good person and you still have, good things to offer it and that kind of thing. But in the middle, the bridge, which is usually the part where you get pumped up, if you know music. And in the bridge, these are the lyrics to the bridge. It says, raise your hands, take a second to breathe in, singing, I am here for a reason. Raise your hands, take a second to breathe in, singing, Alleluia, I am known and loved. Raise your hands, take a second to breathe in, singing, I am here for a reason. Raise your hands, take a second to breathe in, singing, Alleluia, I am known and loved. The whole point of tonight is this, that by knowing our Creator, Elohim, the Elohim of Elohims, we know our purpose. And what is our purpose? To engage in the world and bring order to the chaos. To engage in the world and bring light to the darkness. And how that works itself out for you is different than how it works itself out for me. Maybe that's somebody at your table that you need to engage with. Maybe that's inviting somebody over that doesn't have a good home life. Maybe that's helping somebody out on your team. I don't know what that looks like for you, but I do know that you're supposed to bring order to the chaos of the world, and you're supposed to bring light to the darkness of the world, because you were created in the image of your Creator, and that's what He looks like, and that's how He rules. But we have a problem, because you can't read Genesis 1, as fascinating as it is, it's one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible, and then pair that with chapter 2, which is equally as interesting, and it's interesting in a different way. But if you keep reading, because you're so enthralled with it, with the majesty of the writing, you get to Genesis 3, and then all of a sudden we got tension, right? If you know this story, you're in the part that God set up to be this paradise, and it's this place called Eden. And in the middle of this place called Eden, the Bible describes it as up on a high hill. It's kind of the whole point of Eden and the garden is to be this place where heaven and earth overlap. It's heaven on earth. In a very real way, not just this theory. It's heaven on earth. That's why you have all these different Elohim there, right? And so in the garden, you run into this character, it calls him crafty. It says he's the most crafty of all the animals that God created in the garden. And he approaches Eve, and with Adam standing right there, and he says, they're not supposed to eat this fruit. And he says, you can eat the fruit, right? They're like, no, we can't eat it, we'll die. And the serpent says, no, you're not gonna die. God's holding out on you. He knows that if you eat this, your eyes will be open and you will become like Elohim, knowing good and evil. We find out later that this is, the book of Revelation calls him the ancient serpent, the devil, the accuser, the Satan. He's another Elohim. So instead of becoming like Elohim, we become like that Elohim, and now we know good and evil, and now we're wrestling with this broken relationship with God. And so that's why a lot of time we miss our purpose and we miss what we're supposed to be doing. We miss who we're supposed to be because there's this fracture that happened all the way back in Genesis 3. And that's a problem because we don't look like Elohim a lot of the times, do we? The whole life is trying to get back. Intuitively, inside, we know this. We're trying to get back to Eden. We're trying to get back to where we were. But we keep failing as we try to climb that mountain, and we need a solution. Mark 15 gives us the solution. Let's see what it says. Verse 33, it says, when the 6th hour had come, that's noon in our vernacular, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. So for 3 hours, there's darkness. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, listen to this, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. It's that same root word, El. It's just in a different language. We're looking at El and Elohim. In the original Hebrew, Jesus is talking in Aramaic. It's the same word. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means my God, my God. It's personal now. Why have you forsaken me? Verse 37, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. That's really significant because if you thought that the curtain could be ripped from bottom to top, that you could somehow earn your way back into God's good graces, that you could somehow climb the mountain to get to the top, to get to the Garden of Eden, and your heaven on earth could be accomplished by something that you did, you're very, very mistaken. You can't do it. I've tried. It had to be torn from top to bottom. Heaven had to come down to earth to get you. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God, son of Theos. Theos is the Greek version of the Hebrew word Elohim. See, you were made to be an image and an imager of your creator, the same one we read about in Genesis 1. But there's this fracture. And so now you're broken and you need help from the outside, and Jesus comes and he lived the life that you should have lived. He climbed the mountain that you couldn't climb. He got to Eden through his good works. And they crucified him for it. And in Martin Luther called this the great exchange, that God gave, or Jesus gave you his righteous living, the thing that you couldn't do. And he in turn took your sin, your sinful life. Every time you fall short, every time you don't image the Elohim right, every time you're not a good imager, every time you rule as a poor representative of your creator. In fact, Jesus on the cross was being decreated so that you could be reborn. He did what you couldn't, and then gave you his righteousness. That's how the curtain was torn from top to bottom. And so, as an image of God, now you take that, you live a new life that looks a lot like Jesus, right? Let me read to you, not out of Genesis 1:1, but out of Hebrews 1:1, and then we'll be finished. Hebrews 1:1 says this, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things. Listen to this, through whom also he created the whole world. Genesis 1. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. He looks like God. Jesus said, if you've seen the Father, or if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe just by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. That means it was finished. That's what that means. having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. That's the same name that you inherited as a child of Elohim. So go and learn what this means by the way that you live and by the relationship that you have to the Elohim of Elohims, who is far superior than any other Elohim. He's the one who created you to look like him. Let me pray for you.